Hi, everyone. This is the talk on effectively using web platform tests. So the goal of this talk is hopefully to provide some guidance and advice for if you want to be writing or modifying or reviewing or anything related to web platform tests. And what is web platform tests? So we're going to start first with an overview of web platform tests. And then later talk about more in detail about advice and pointers. So first, web platform tests. It is a testing effort, and it is a repo. It's a GitHub repo, and it's a collection of tests for the web platform. It's tests for all of the web platform except for ECMAScript and WebGL, but basically all of the web platform. So if you're testing anything that's part of the web platform, then using web platform tests would be excellent. Let's see. Oh yeah, and then on the, let's see. Okay, so it's a cross-browser effort, so it has buy-in from all the major browser vendors. And this is the reason why it's really useful for people contributing to Blink to know about, because by using the web platform tests rather than just the Blink layout tests, we can leverage tests that are added by other people. And by improving and modifying and adding tests and web platform tests, we can encourage interoperability and move the web platform forward. So as a general background about the tests, they're basically like layout tests. And there's two interesting types of web platform tests. There are testharness.js tests and reference tests or Reftests. They're organized in the repository as under top-level directories, where each top-level directory corresponds to a specification, a web standard. And there's a few ways that you can explore them if you want to get an overall view of them. You can explore them in the Chromium source tree. They're under layout test external WPT, or in the GitHub repo. And then another way to explore the web platform tests and see how everything is the web platform test dashboard, which is WPT. This is the next slide. Which is wpt.fyi. So excellent domain name. So when you go to that dashboard to explore the tests first, that you get the listing of top-level directories, and you click in, and then you can get more like a summary of passing and failing tests in that directory, and then you keep on drilling down, and you can get to the results for a specific test in the 4 major browsers. And from this page, you can also view the test on w3c-test.org, where you can run that test as it's checked in your browser right then, which is really helpful for exploring the current set of tests. All right. So once you've got an overall view of web platform tests and you want to run and debug tests, there are a couple suggested recommended ways to run them. The first is running it with run-webkit-tests, the same way that layout tests are run. And this is also the way that they're run on the bots. And so it should be as simple as just running run-webkit-tests, external WPT, and then the path to the test. And run-webkit-tests takes a lot of flags that you can use to make it print the results of the test or standard error. And so this is a great way to run the tests. But it may be a little bit slow, and it's very useful to run the test in the browser for debugging. So running the tests in the browser requires a little bit of setup, but once you've got it set up, it's easier to debug the test and see specifically what's happening. So the setup is some changes to the hosts file on your computer, and then starting the wpt-serve server, which starts HTTP and HTTPS servers on various ports. And once that's running, you can just visit the page in your browser and use DevTools, etc., to see specifically what's happening. Yeah, next slide. So once you do that, it looks like this. Excellent. Oh, yeah.
When you use the command line wpt test runner, runs them using content shell, is it always going to run them using content shell? Will it one day run them using Chrome headless? Is there any thoughts one way or the other?
Yeah, so the question is, when you the run-webkit-tests script, will it always necessarily run the tests with content shell, or may it run it with other things such as Chrome headless? And the answer is, it may run the tests with other things, not necessarily content shell forever. Within the layout test runner code, it's referred to as the driver, and the driver is usually content shell. But I think that it works differently for Android. I'm not sure about that, though. All right, moving on. A question.
I am using wpt runner, which is just like the V1 from shell.
Yeah.
What is the difference between run-webkit-tests and
the WPT runner is the runner script that comes with web platform tests. And the question is, what's the difference between run-webkit-tests and WPT runner? So run-webkit-tests is the script for running Blink layout tests inherited from the WebKit heritage. And so run-webkit-tests does a bunch of extra stuff that may be necessary for layout tests. As far as I know, I think WPT runner actually opens the browser and runs the test in that. So that's another major difference in the behavior. So as a Blink developer, it's a little bit easier to use run WebKit tests, but you can also get a checkout of the upstream repo and run it with the other script, which is another way to run it. All right, so the next topic is an interesting thing to know about, which is that we have a copy of web platform tests in Chromium, and there's the upstream repo, and we want changes in both places to be reflected. And so there's a two-way sync process, which has been added in the last couple of years. So tests are imported. You can generally expect them to be imported within a day or so. Not all directories are imported, and so if you want to enable importation of a new directory, then you can unskip it in the magical layout tests W3C import expectations file. Yeah, and then there's also export, where if you make a change to a web platform test in Chromium, a PR will be made automatically for the web platform tests repository. A GitHub pull request will be made, and there are some CI checks that will be run, and a comment is posted on the commit that you've made to change web platform tests. But as a Blink developer, you should basically not necessarily need to care about this a lot. All right, and pull requests on GitHub for WPT look like this, made by a robot account. All right, okay, so now Geoffrey, I didn't introduce us at the beginning of the talk. Hi everybody, I'm Quinten Yearsley. And I'm really happy here today. There's Geoffrey Sneddon. And do we have a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask, you said there is a pull request is automatically generated. When the request is rejected, or there is a code review, like we shouldn't expect that they would always accept it.
Yes. So a pull request is automatically generated, and the question is, what happens if the pull request is rejected or it doesn't get merged upstream? And that's a possible problem. And in practice, it's generally resolved by the ecosystem infra team.
So there's no extra review step when it goes into that PR. It merged by bot as long as it's stable, or the GitHub CI. So there's no human in the loop most of the time.
That's right. Okay. So the next part of the talk is testing tips, and Geoffrey will talk.
Don't worry, I'll introduce myself at the end. Okay, so I'm just going to give sort of a vague overview of a few things that are probably going to be helpful writing web platform tests. I'm sure most of you have seen testharness.js tests before, but to make sure everyone knows roughly what we're dealing with, HTML files, import a couple of scripts, and they call a test function, and you run a test in it. More interestingly are async tests used for testing asynchronous parts of the web platform. And these are obviously important because, well, you can't test everything with synchronous APIs if what you're testing is asynchronous. The important point here, though, is the difference between async test and promise test. Promise test is essentially used for testing APIs that return promises, as you might expect. But notably, it also only ever runs one test at a time, unlike async test, where it could run everything all at once.
So any reason not to change that? Seems quite.
So the question is, why don't we change it for async tests?
Yeah, why don't we make async tests, right?
Because I think I can't remember. I think there was some conclusion that there were some tests that relied on multiple tests running at the same time, changing state or something. Really horrible.
That seems even more horribly broken.
Create a test and then you can do something code that is
Yeah, but you do
normally
too.
part of the test, but like
Yeah. So the way async test works is you create an async test and then you call the next step of it. So if you were to create two async tests and then have one where the next step is, say, the load event firing, and another where it's another image loading, you couldn't in any way actually guarantee which one of those images are going to load it. So you couldn't necessarily, like without changing the API, you couldn't enforce an ordering.
I think that we don't have any async test in terms of that, it's not called, done function not called on it. So as soon as all the async tests have to be done, call the test will finish as a task for example. What do we do for the promise? So for when one sequence like have a few test sequences line. So the first promise is finished, then break one doesn't finish that. Maybe I can start over. So
My problem is I've not actually dealt that much with the implementation of how promise tests work. So
When you create a new promise test, it changes the.
So when you create a new promise test, it will start that promise test when it basically just creates a chain of a promise chain containing containing each promise test as you create them. So as the promise returned by the function for the previous promise test resolves, it will execute or rejects. It will start the next promise test.
Is it so I like using promise tests because I like using promises, but it sounds like it could be slower than async test if I have a lot of tests. Is there a way to not have them run serially, or is that by design?
So the question is whether promise tests run serially by design and whether this can make them slower. The concern was avoiding potential flakiness from having multiple things running at once interacting with the same thing. So it's a deliberate design decision to avoid any potential flakiness.
I mean, you can still do it. You can create a bunch of promises and then pass all those promises to promise tests. They'll just all run immediately.
Yeah.
Conversely, I have definitely written async tests which have an async function as the async function, as the function for the test and just promises internally.
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, promise test is essentially can do a subset of what async test can. So realistically, you can do things with async test if you really want to be dealing with lots of promises all at once.
It sounds like it's actually better to promise tests so that it's less leaky.
Yeah. I mean, if you're very careful, you can, of course, avoid any chance of flakiness, but people aren't perfect.
If I remember correctly, promise test was ordinary, but
Yeah.
the policy changed at some time for concerns for flakiness. So I was a bit surprised for inconsistency between async test and promise test.
So the question is about the fact that promise test did change behavior because it was originally running them all in parallel, and async test didn't change, and the inconsistency here. The problem here is that async test can't really be changed because it's too much of a low-level primitive to be able to actually enforce any sort of sequencing. Whereas because you can chain promises relatively easily, you can actually enforce an order quite easily. Well, you can't enforce an order, you can ensure you only have one running at once. Ish.
You definitely, I mean, we could change async test to be serialized, right? Then we just not invoke the step function if we're not just swaps already, but that would just matter how much work it is. It's not impossible.
We can make well,
You-
what the async test API, where you pass things into async test.
You can't really guarantee it, regardless, but yeah.
But it's surprising.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, one thing to bear in mind actually around web platform tests is that file names do have some meaning. Not going to touch too much on this, but there's a few things that have hyphens in them, which like hyphen manual to make it a manual test. And then there's a bunch of things where we have dot separated things before the extension. And most obviously is .https used to make tests run over HTTPS, which, yes. And we also have .sub, which is important because web platform test doesn't actually guarantee what host name the tests are running from. So if you want to do anything that's cross-origin, because you aren't allowed to rely on external servers because that would be ridiculously flaky, we have a substitution language to allow you to get at other domains that the web platform test server is listing on. And these are actually sort of a more general feature called pipes. And the other notable one here is trickle, which is useful for testing loading. Because you can make it delay the file being downloaded to, well, being sent rather to the client. And we can also set HTTP headers just by creating a file. One of the big things that's being worked on at the moment is around user interaction and making it possible to test things that rely on user input. Like click and hopefully in the not too distant future, more complex things around pointer events and keyboard input and the like. Go back.
Oh.
At the moment in Blink, we have a very general mechanism of JavaScript helper files in layout tests /external/WPT automation, and then just in matching file path to the test file. And these can call any of the normal Blink internal test APIs. What we're adding to web platform tests upstream, and hopefully will be there within a couple of weeks, is this testautomation.click API, which takes DOM element and then it returns a promise that resolves when that has been clicked. And we're going to generalize that to also be able to deal with more and more complex pieces of input. The other test type is Reftests, which work in vaguely the same way as layout tests, reference tests, but have one very big difference, which is that they refer to the reference with an element within the document rather than being based on the file name.
I don't know when we're supposed to end because the lightning talks are at 4. But.
Sure. Yeah. But basically, you take a screenshot of that and the reference, and you compare them. And you have some control over the timing, but only insofar as it's taken after a certain point, but not when after.
We have until 4, so don't worry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Still, you can talk about it 4.
Keep going.
Okay.
Shush, guys. So these are a few general tips from experience of what people have had been told, various code reviews by various people, having asked around a bunch of people for opinions on what's the common problems that they see Blink developers doing when writing web platform tests. The top one is writing overly long, overly complex tests. Instead of keeping stuff as simple as possible for what's actually being tested. But when you are writing longer tests, you really should be considering whether they're going to be maintainable. Comments are good, even in tests. Like, if you won't be able to understand what the test is meant to be testing in 6 months' time without digging through version control history, you probably should be documenting it better. One notable difference compared with the Blink layout tests is the expectations are meant to be what the spec says, rather than what Blink's current behavior is. Hopefully this doesn't happen too often. Yeah, when it does, it might be a case that it should be a tentative test and it's not quite ready yet what it's testing. In other cases, contacting the ecosystem infra team is probably a good idea. And also, you should probably concern yourself with the case of the product being tested not supporting the feature run to test, because it's being run cross-browser, so we can't rely on every browser having some new feature supported. If you need help in general around web platform tests, there's a few things. If you want advice about some specific test, you can try asking people named to the owners files. More generally, there's an IRC channel on the W3 IRC server, which generally has people around it, and all kinds of stuff gets asked there from time to time. There's a mailing list which is mostly about policy nowadays. GitHub issues can be used for most things, especially if there's any problem with the test, or even if you just think there might be a problem with the test. it's probably better to err on the side of caution and file the bug regardless of whether there actually is a problem in it or not. And there's also Chromium mailing list if you want to reach out to other people in Chromium first. Yeah, and there's a bunch of documentation, both in the Chromium repo and upstream. And I think that's it. If anyone has any questions, you can hopefully answer them. Yes.
So layout tests, I think we only have like a small subset of like smoke tests that run on Android. Do we run any web platform tests on mobile platforms, or do we have plans to do that?
In the smoke, there is. Okay, so in the smoke test file, there's a few web platform tests. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
So is the plan going forward that there's just going to be a small subset of the web platform tests we run?
Ideally, we would run a lot more tests on Android.
Yeah, 'cause I think the reason we did that was there's just such a large backlog of layout tests that we can't get past on Android, but this seems like a good opportunity to forward everything.
That's a good point. Although I don't think that we have very clear plans about running more tests on Android, but we should.
It's probably also worth pointing out there is a long tail of tens of thousands of tests already in web platform tests, so it's probably not necessarily any better than just dealing with layout tests. Though I know at least previously some of them were run on Firefox OS. Though I don't know if that's all of them.
Relatedly, wpt.fyi lists Chrome, Firefox, Safari. It doesn't list mobile versions of any of the above. Aren't there plans to start running those on mobile browsers, even if they're failing miserably?
So the question is, are there plans to include mobile browsers on wpt.fyi? And as far as I'm aware, the answer is yes, there are.
Well, it depends on how useful it would be. I mean, if they want to invest in, how useful would it be to have those results? Compared to be very useful. Yeah, but compared to, for example, getting even newer versions of Edge, Safari, for example, is also another obvious thing we could do. So, yes, it would be useful, but how useful compared to other things?
So yeah, as Philip was basically saying, a lot of this is down to prioritization.
Please tell us what's most useful.
I think it's quite likely we're going to work on getting up-to-date developer builds of Safari and Edge running before we work on mobile browsers at all.
How old are the ones you have?
They are the latest available on Source Labs, which I think is Safari 10, unfortunately 10.0. So it's not even the latest stable Safari. And it is the latest stable release of Edge, but not insider builds of Edge, therefore.
I see. All right. I think that's out of time.
Was there no one else? Okay.
All right. Excellent.
Thank you.